You know, I'm editor-in-chief of the Atlantic's Events Division, Rosanna, and I sometimes have a beef with my team's titles for things. And so sometimes this is Future Now, Atlantic Future Now. It's very rah-rah. Why don't you tell me for a minute, as one of the great divas of America on robots, why it's not Future Now, and how frustrated you are in the robotics world not being where you think we should be in terms of getting the gains you think we should be getting from the robotics world.
Yeah, so there tends to be this misconception that robots are really intelligent, that they're really accessible, and specifically I think when people think about manufacturing, which is where there's the biggest pull today in robotics, we tend to think that everything is automated. We tend to think that it's really, that it's a really streamlined process. But so if you had to guess, how many of all the tasks that could be automated in manufacturing, how many do you think are? What percentage?
Let me ask my friend, is it Mark here in the front row? What's your percentage, you think? Yeah. 2%?
Of tasks automated?
Yeah.
So it's 90% of tasks that could be automated are done by hand. So it's about 10% of tasks.
10%?
Yes.
So we learned something there.
And these typically are not difficult tasks to do. They're very repetitive. They're things like putting a bit of glue, moving a piece of plastic, putting a screen together. But they're almost never automated today. And a lot of times people don't realize that robots are very difficult to use. They're super expensive. And there's a big power differential between the people who have tasks that they need to automate and the people who actually know what's going on.
So as you got into this business years ago, and I just for the audience who may not know, as a CEO of Carbon Robotics, tell us what exactly you were making, you were doing, what problems you're solving.
So we make intelligent robotic arms. And so
this kind of arm.
Not prosthetic.
This kind of arm.
About this size.
Yeah, okay. So they're arms for manufacturing?
Exactly. So robotic arms are the most versatile tool. Depending on what you put on the end, they can become something completely different. You can think of them as a human arm. And so that was the interest to me, is that it's the tool that can become any tool.
I hear Elon Musk needs some of these that work.
Yeah. They actually, the systems that they use are KUKA robots, and I trained on those giant ones that you've seen at Tesla. And you like this. So to program those robots, you need to know KRL, which is KUKA robot language. It is a proprietary language that they've made up. It's based on Pascal, which is procedural language from the 60s. And basically, they're programming robots the same way that it was done 60 years ago, or from the 60s. And so when people look at the troubles that Tesla and some of the other companies are having with
So this is important. Tesla is having its challenges, you're suggesting, because of a Pascal-based language for its robot
The tools are terrible. The tools are absolutely terrible. So typically when you're programming a robot, you have this big pendant, and you are guiding it through space. You've got a joystick or you've got buttons, and you say, I want to go here, I want to go here, I want to go here. And these are completely random points. And they don't have any context. There's no vision. There's nothing included in the robot. And so what that means is it takes a really long time to do, and then there's no flexibility. And so when they were having a hell of a time getting all of these pieces to work together, a lot of that was that the tools they were using were unbelievably archaic.
So how do you get to a place, and I'm very aware that we're at a very cool trade show here, and I've snuck in without my ID badge to look at a lot of this, the things that are part of what's going on in terms of platform and enterprise and data. What do you think? Let's just put you in charge. What do you have to fix so that the Future Now title that we have on this today is legitimate?
So one of the major things we have to shift are the unit economics involved in robots. So low-cost arms are typically $30,000, $40,000, but the total cost of all of the hardware that you need and all of the programming that goes into them is on average about $130,000 per robot per task. And so you can imagine that when you want to change something, if you're changing an assembly line every 3 to 6 weeks, that's the average, it's never possible to actually automate, because the unit economics don't work out, and it's also very difficult to program. So I think the number one thing that we need is robots that can actually understand the world around them. So integrated vision. Robots today really can't see what's going on. They have if you add vision, it's typically a completely separate system. Robotics has never had a just works experience. We expect that with computers, we got that with mobile phones, but robots has never had that. And the key to doing that well, is integrating vision. It's giving robots contextual understanding, so it's not, I moved from this random place to this random place, I picked something up and I moved it. That's flexible. And when we can give robots that kind of flexibility, then they start to make decisions.
How do you think, I mean, you know, maybe this sounds like a cliche now, but I am interested in the impact on, you know, people and jobs. I was in North Carolina recently and went to the Boeing plant where they're basically building, you know, the Dreamliner there. They're building and assembling all different dimensions of it. And I went around the floor and met the engineers that were coming from the local schools and colleges. But overwhelmingly you saw these, I didn't know we were going to meet, but you saw these arms. Arms were doing everything there. Not everything, but people were there essentially monitoring. How do you think, as somebody who has insights in, I mean, I ask you this facetiously in the room, do you like people arms more than robot arms? Are you
I'm a big fan of people.
A robot-obsessed person? And do you worry about that?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to look at it. So when you look at some of the tasks that aren't automated today, these are not tasks that any person would want to do. So let me give you an example of
but I'm sure there are engineers, or there are people that aren't engineers, but people who used to assemble airplanes that liked what they were doing, and now they're not able to do that because there's some efficient and better way to do so.
Well, if you're able to do something like that, but typically it's something much more simple. Typically, the first tasks that robots can do, it's something like scraping bits of metal for 8 hours a day, the same part all day, day in, day out. And that's the face of manufacturing, is typically you're doing the same task for 8 hours a day. And then it's 8 hours, 8 hours, 8 hours, back-to-back shifts. And so for those types of tasks, those are not things that we would expect people to really want to do. But the key, I think, to making sure that they can shift into roles that are closer to what you would have with an engineer, where they're sort of monitoring it and they're doing more creative work, is that the tools themselves have to be able to meet people where they are. Today, robots are designed to be used by engineers. I think robots should really be designed to be used by the operator, by the person who is loading today. And in order to do that, we have to radically rethink how we have user interaction, safety, how we actually train people. Really comes down to what we can get encoded into the robot itself. And so at Carbon, we're really passionate about making sure that the operator can program the robots. And then what you get something interesting, because when you can shift the unit economics, so let's say 10 times cheaper, and what you can do is have a workforce that's ready to go because they didn't have to learn anything, then what you start to give manufacturers is scale. And manufacturers today do not have the ability to scale, and I think that's the exciting piece.
Can I ask, you know, just out of interest, is anyone in the room in the robotics field, robotics profession? I know my friend Mike Krell over here is in Internet of Things, which is almost robotics, right? Kind of? Maybe not. No, he's saying no, definitely not. So we have one person over here. Did Google buy you? No. So I want to ask you, because I mean this seriously, not just facetiously, but Rosanna is not a big fan of Google. If you read and go into this and kind of look at
it was one article, Steve.
I know one article, but it was a hell of an article, and you kind of like depicted Google as the sort of Mordor of robotics, in which a healthy, vital, thriving robotics industry with a lot of diversity and innovation was gobbled up and paralyzed. And where am I wrong in my depiction?
So in 2013, Google had a big push into robotics, and they bought a ton of companies. And there aren't really that many people who work in robotics. It's a very esoteric skill set. You typically need to know a few different domains. There just aren't that many people.
Right.
And so people were really excited. They thought, wow, this is going to be a real renaissance for robotics. But what actually happened was all of the talent got gobbled up. And people were shifted away from projects that could have been really solid businesses, and shifted onto other projects, and sort of every 6 months or every 9 months having to start again. And so they ended up never deploying they made incredible technology. They are brilliant. They hired brilliant engineers who have not deployed anything into the market.
So that is like a future preempted move. Do you think, I'm sure that wasn't Google's intention, What does that mean? Because I'm interested in the structure of innovation, if there is a structure, and how, when you're kind of looking at enterprise, and we had Nico up here talking about data, you have a lot of these different pieces that are sort of evolving. And I remember talking, some of you may know Tom Khalil, who used to be a science and technology advisor to President Obama as well as to President Clinton, and he would talk about this, Steve, people basically get caught up in fads of like one element of science or one element of technology, when you really need the whole ecosystem to grow together. You need mathematics to grow, you need physics to grow, you need all these other dimensions. So what was it in Google's play that undid innovation and then kind of held back, I guess, innovation success?
So a lot of the projects that were viable were not deemed to be Google scale. And it was a $100 million market, which is not Google scale. And I think that was probably the biggest piece that did it.
And how is Carbon Robotics dealing with that now?
So we're happy with a $100 million market. So we approach innovation in a couple different ways. I think a lot of times one of the challenges in robotics is people get really, really excited about the technology and not so much the product that you're getting out into the world. And I'd say we're probably the most product-focused and people-focused robotics company. And a lot of that goes into your question about do we prefer people or robots. We really like people. I mean, robots should serve people. That's the whole purpose of it. And I think there are tons of examples of companies where they had really talented engineers and they ended up building a product that no one wanted because they weren't listening.
Do you think that in the world in which you're building, what you sort of, do you have a vision? Do you see something? I was talking to a gentleman out here and said, the best question to ask everyone in the panel is really, what does the world look like 10 years from now? And is that in your mind, or are you, because that would mean that you've got a vision that we're actually trying to drive toward, or do we have a vision where we're incrementalists in what technology, and I remember interviewing Elon Musk once, he said, the only limit on him is physics. Now, it may be bad robotic software, but I think if you're looking at the way in which the future is decided in terms of the competition, I'm sort of interested in how you as a company sort of look at what the world may look like in 10 years from now, and whether you're going toward that or whether you're following a more techno-determined route that doesn't know the future.
So I think one of the things that we made a big point of when we started, which was this comes from starting with the product in mind, is rather than saying, what's the technology that we've got, okay, where can we put that, which is very incremental, we said, how should the world be? And so, for example, we believe that operators should be able to set up the robots themselves. So what that means is that the robots need to understand the environment, so they need to have vision. And they need to be able to integrate that into some kind of understanding of the world. Then you work backwards to what technology you need. And for us, it's always much more about what's the right way of solving a problem. And we had this issue as well. When we started the company, we were told it absolutely couldn't be done. We were told that it wasn't possible to build such a low-cost ARM. And we were looking at this, and we were looking at modern DSPs, modern GPUs, and we're like, I kind of think like it definitely doesn't violate the laws of physics. And it's possible that there are different ways of constructing robots, because robotic design hasn't actually, for robot arms, has not changed in 60 years. It's pretty much made the same way.
How many years?
60 years. It's pretty much
60.
Made the same way, same components. There are incremental improvements. But when we're talking about doing things like really complicated calculations, so basically, you can think of it this way. The more the robot knows, the less the person has to. So the more the robot knows, you need a lot of computational power on that robot, which means you have to build them very, very differently. And so when we're looking at how we build them, so our robot, for instance, everything that we did to make, so we made a robot that was about 10 times cheaper, but higher performance because we were moving from analog to digital. So it's only just been possible to do it in just this way. But that was the foundation for doing much more of the intelligent work that we've done, work on intelligence that we've done recently.
What partners do you need to succeed? You and I were talking a little bit about US government investment. Is this something that you need Donald Trump's support in, or can you do it without him? I mean, and I'm saying that facetiously because I don't want to talk about the president in a way here, but do you need federal government investment in this arena to move forward? Because I know that China, I know that Japan, I know that Korea, I know that Germany have put an enormous amount of money into the ecosystem of research around advanced automation. I'm not sure that's robotics, but about
no, it is.
About all the dimensions
robotics.
of that. And so, how do we compare to that kind of investment in the kind of knowledge infrastructure around your industry?
Pitiful. We really, the US is massively underinvesting in core technologies, specifically around robotics and AI. So people were really excited last year because there was an advanced robotics manufacturing institute that got $250 million to go towards companies, and I think 80 million of that was from the federal government. In China, there are 2 provinces that have invested 270 billion just in those 2, like think of them as 2 different states.
I can't fact check this right now. 270 billion is a lot, really? Yeah.
So it's in the main manufacturing areas.
Nico Grand of Bloomberg, I'm counting on you to fact check this out there. He's in the audience.
But it's massively different. And they're focused. They're very focused. So there's the Made in China 2020.
So where is DARPA? Where is ARPA-E? I mean, because there are energy dimensions to this, right? So there's ARPA-E and there's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which, as I understand it, really invented everything we think the private sector invented.
Right.
So,
that's why we have the internet.
do are they absent in this?
There's certainly, I mean, there are projects and there are investments, but it is not the same national focus that you see in other countries. So in China, they have this initiative, Made in China 2025, and their goal is to become the robotics and AI superpower of the world. That is the explicit goal. And there are many pieces of that. For instance, they want about 50%, and keep fact-checking, they want about 50% of those robots to be made in China, and they're looking at pure self-sufficiency. So like 70% of production being self-sufficient, so able to, for the raw materials and the means of production. And so they're very serious about becoming the global superpower. And in the US, we have a very small amount of investment, and we don't have a focus that we're deciding to do that we're deciding to be at the forefront. And the reality is, so we had a huge advantage with the internet because of things like ARPANET. We don't have that now. And there's this sort of arrogance and this malaise around expecting that it will be there, and we're not investing in anything that would make that be true. And I think that people are in for a bit of a surprise if we don't turn it around.
I'm going to go to audience and get your guys' questions and comments in just a minute. But I want to get out of the wonky stuff here and then get into the kind of the magical, really super cool and the raw parts of this. Flying back from Europe last night, I watched a thing on underwater exploration. I clicked around and I saw a thing on the Mars rover. I think, and the folks that built it says it's a she, so Curiosity was her name. And so when we think of robotics and we think about automated systems, they can be data systems, they can be machine systems, they can be, what do you think from a media perspective we're not telling the story right about when it comes to the magic? Because I know you're obsessed with this stuff. So what are we not what's the magic you feel in the robotics world and future that you wish we told the story better than we're doing?
So I think robots inherently do 2 things. On the one hand, they can help us do tasks that no human really wants to do. There's a massive ability.
I really would like to run around Mars, but I can't yet. Yes.
Well, until that time. This is the first time in history where enough technologies have converged that we're actually able to eliminate a lot of human suffering. I spent a lot of time in factories that are just miserable. They are literally scraping metal, so I grew up in the countryside in England, and it's like going back in time before the combine harvester. It's really unreal. But what's exciting is the flip side, which is that these are tools that have the ability to amplify human potential. And when we think about, my background's in software engineering, I was a developer, and what I get excited about is what happens when we enable people who are software developers for computers, for mobile phones, to actually become the developers of robots. So it shouldn't be that you have to build the robot. Today you have to build the robot. You book time on a robot if you're at university. But when we start to make these into building blocks and to build developer tools, then we're going to see all sorts of things. And we have people who want to do like cake decorating and mad art projects and really cool motion control. There's so much potential for creativity, and it's solving little pieces of it, but when you do enough of that, it's really, I think it's going to be a really exciting world.
Cool, I can tell you're. Let me go to our robotics guy real quick and give him an opportunity if you want to ask the first comment. There you go. See? Yeah, and you've got a friend that pointed you out right there, right here, yes.
Okay. My name is Gary Minchell. I'm
Hi, Gary.
a former editor of Automation World magazine. I'm a blogger, and I've been programming robots since about '85.
Wow.
But anyway, isn't the current trend, isn't a lot of what you've been talking about really past? And you know, machining and welding and that sort of stuff is what robots do, pick and place. But the current trend for the last few years has been, and I interview CEOs of like all the companies, so I need to see you. But anyway, the big thing is cobots. So everybody is working on how we get robots to work with people. What we've done for the last 30 years is take people out of unsafe environments and let the robots do it. And now we have people and robots working together. Is that like one of the current?
It's a terrific question about whether the future is more cobot. I find, you know, and thank you for raising that, because when I was going to ask you a question about 60 years ago, and you've been working on this 85, what are the substantial changes in evolution, if you will, in the robotic sector? And, you know, and go back to Mark's question here in the front, 10 years from now, what will the robotics evolution be yielding?
Yeah, so this is a really, really exciting notion that robots can work alongside people, and I love the name, cobot. What we see, though, is that there's a big difference between the excitement around the potential and then what actually gets deployed. So one very just specific example, the way that robots today are collaborative is they have this thing called force sensing, which means that when they touch you, they can stop or they slow down, which means they have to be running really, really slowly. So it's way better than them not being able to sense where you are, but it means they have to run very, very slowly. And when you look at why they're not being adopted in a manufacturing environment, a lot of times you have to make this trade-off. If you have to run at 20% of your rated speed versus reaching your throughput targets, that's not a trade-off that you can make. And so I think that we need to start looking at different kinds of sensors and different kind of ways that we can actually make them more readily deployed in the areas where they're not being deployed today. And I think there's a ton of potential, but the fraction of deployment of the deployments is a small fraction of what you have with industrial robots.
Other questions, comments? Yes, right here in the front, and we'll go over here. He didn't even know what was going on here. He came for a free drink.
From France.
You got a good free drink, though, right, earlier?
Yeah, already. In fact, there is also some other possibilities. And I will take a new buzzword, AH, augmented human. Because already in factories, there is some exoskeleton or exo arms that helps in solving the problem of the context of the robots. Because the human has already the context to do the right thing. Are you already on this side to have an augmented human and not only artificial intelligence and robotics?
So to physically attach to humans, is that what you mean?
Yes, totally. It exists already in some factories in China or Japan.
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
It's already existing in some factories in China and Japan. In fact, it's at the arm of the human, but it's augmented by the strength and the possibility of the robots.
That's very cool. We don't do that, though. We don't do prosthetic arms.
You're pretty industrial.
We are.
Right. And then right over here in the right, or yes, on your left, my right, stage right.
Ariane Rüdiger, freelancer from Germany. I would like to ask first, what has the machine to do with it? Because that was one of the introductions of you. And second, what kinds are the AI algorithms you are using in your robots? Is it neural networks, or because our new neural networks are often used for visual identification, or what other types of algorithms are you using?
Yeah, and can I just piggyback, because I think of this great question about the algorithms you use, and what are the limitations now, and where do they have to go to actually get to something? So hopefully, that's a great question, but because that will actually address the next panel as well that we're going to discuss, but algorithmic limits, if you will.
Mm-hmm. So for a lot of what we do, for many of the initial applications, we don't really need to use much in the way of machine learning to be able to do that. I think we are very excited about parts of what we're implementing, but one of the big problems that people often don't talk about, but is a really big deal, is the issue with explainability. So if you have a robot make a decision and that robot cannot explain why it made that decision, that's a very dangerous scenario. And so when we're looking at what algorithms we're using or where we're deploying it, we're taking that very seriously, and we're only looking at it when it can serve a customer and when it can serve an application. And so for us, we haven't had to do it with our initial applications.
Let me just ask you in conclusion, your Twitter, for those of you who want to follow us, Rosanna, WHO, Rosanna Who, and her thing says, founder, CEO of Carbon Robotics, breaker of chains, mother of robots. So definitely Game of Thrones-ish. Is winter coming, I guess I could ask. But when you kind of set that up, I mean, that's sort of a very explosive nature that just around the corner there is going to be dragons, et cetera, or something. But what do you when you think about what's around the corner that we're not seeing, our blind spot about a world of automation, a world of Internet of Things, a world of data that's sensing and machines talking to each other, what is the most exciting piece of that to you?
What's most exciting to me is that when one of the problems that we've had when we have tools that don't understand the world is that we have to treat humans like machines. And what's the most exciting to me is when we look at how we can connect these robots. For the first time, we're actually able to treat humans like humans. And that's what's most exciting to me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rosanna Myers, co-founder and CEO of Carbon Robotics.
Thank you
so much for joining us.